Okay, time again for another video presentation. This time we're talking about biodiversity again, and biodiversity on the land, the terrestrial biodiversity. And this is talking about the ecosystems themselves and how we can protect them. So now we're talking about things that are there naturally, what we as humans are doing to use them, and how we can perhaps do this a little bit more sustainably. Okay, so one of the things, the case study that we talked about is the wolves in Yellowstone. They had eradicated the wolves in Yellowstone and thought that they were pretty much a nuisance. They were getting into the cattle, and they were causing damage to property in that sense because they are predators, so they saw the cattle as prey, whereas we saw the cattle as money-making and livestock and our property. So that was a little bit of a conflict between the wolves and the human beings. And we got rid of them for the longest time, and then we kind of thought we might have gone a little bit too far. So in 1973, we came up with the Endangered Species Act, and the wolves were endangered. They were pretty much eradicated in the wild. And then they decided in the late 1900s, middle to late 1900s, to reintroduce them to Yellowstone Park, and they found that they had a big effect on what's going on. Very successful, and now they are no longer needing protection. So they found out that the wolf, being a top predator, a keystone species, was able to maintain the population of the prey species. That was one of the things. And there goes the light again. And they also found that in the prey species, the deer and the species that were taken out by the wolves now, cutting down their numbers, had an effect on the plants, the growth of the plants, really, and the video that we've probably already shown in class at some point, changed the course of the rivers, cut down on soil erosion, trees were able to grow where they weren't before, the deer moved up into higher elevations. And so this is a really great example of how one species can have a big effect on all the other species and the ecosystem itself. Change the course of rivers, they did, by introducing the wolves. All right, so keystone species for sure. Okay, so let's talk about forests here, first of all. Old growth or primary forests are forests that haven't been disturbed in any great way for over 200 years. That's what we call the old growth forests. Second growth forests are forests that have come back after they've been cleared away. We've got a lot more of that going on in this area now. Originally, when the settlers came over, they cleared out the trees pretty good, but we've had the forests coming back. And then there is tree plantations, where we do this commercially and hopefully sustainably as well. And that's 6% of the forestry in the United States. Okay, so here's a little question for you. What do you think? Other than Greenland and Antarctica, there's no forest there. What percent of the Earth's land is occupied by forests? Well, 30% is the answer to that one. So it's a big chunk there. And there's good reasons to keep the forest intact, and there's also good reasons to exploit the forest. So here's some old-growth forests, an old-growth forest and an old-growth tropical forest as well. And some of these trees are amazing. I've got the chance to go out west and stand by some of these trees, and you just look up. They've been there for a long time, and that's the idea of the old-growth forests. Some of those old-growth forests have been compromised in the past for us to use them as resources. But there's still some out there, and you can go see them. Okay, so here's the idea of the succession that would come back. If you clear-cut an area, and we'll talk more about clear-cutting later, it'll take a little while for them to come back, and after 25 years or so, you start getting a little bit of a comeback on the forest. So that would be a secondary forest, which is coming back after being disturbed. And here is a tree plantation where they're lining up the trees in rows, so that gives you an idea of what's going on there. Okay, so the forests are very important for us anyway. One thing is they are involved in chemical cycling. The forests and the roots that are in the ground are going to cut down on soil erosion. When you remove the trees, there's going to be a lot more erosion. Some of that sediment gets into water. There's a big ripple effect that's going on there. They're involved with the hydrological cycle, obviously taking in water, and then the transpiration through the leaves as well. So that's a big part of the hydrological cycle. And because of this, they can influence the climate. And another big thing is they are a carbon sink, meaning that they will store up a large amount of carbon. And also, of course, releasing oxygen for us as well. So these are pretty important things. Other than that, they are habitats for lots of species, and people as well live in the forest areas. So they're habitats, and when we get rid of them, we get rid of those habitats. But they're used also for building materials, for paper. In the forests, if we clear them out, we can find there's things to mine there. When they also clear them out, there are places for the livestock to go. And of course, people like to go to the forests as well, and camping and this kind of thing, and so the recreation as well, which leads to employment. Okay, so here are some things about the forest too, and maybe why we should, before we cut them down, take a look at what we have there. The people will use these for traditional medicines, and a lot of these medicines, I guess you could look at an old-time medicine person or something like that who understands the different plants and what their medicinal benefits are. But we have also found these for prescription drugs now. We take things that are done in nature and now adapt them to prescription drugs. And the home to about 300 million people, so almost the population of the United States is living in forested areas. And yeah, about a quarter of the world's population depends on the forest for their livelihood. So this is the deal about the forests here. Okay, so again, we've talked about all these different things that they've done here, and this is a little bit of a gimmick. I'm sure this price tag could change and adjusted for inflation and all those things, but the idea is if you put a price tag on it, what we're getting out of the forest is lots and lots of money. Here at the time of this video, or this presentation here, was 4.7 trillion per year. So that's what it would take if we were trying to do all this stuff without the forests. Okay, and this just gives you a breakdown of what they're doing for us. Just the idea of the nutrient cycling that we talked about, one of the 4 basic principles of sustainability. That's you know, billions of dollars in itself. So there you go, erosion, as we've talked about, and all these other things broken down for you. Okay, so what are we doing? If we are doing unsustainable logging, of course, we're going to jeopardize the forests. If you take down a forest that's been around for a while and cut it down, it's going to take a while for it to come back to where it was before. And as I mentioned before, the roots of the trees will hold the soil together, so when the trees are gone, you're going to have more erosion. Once you get in there and you start logging, you have to build a road, so right away you're fragmenting the habitats, and as you go in there and cut down the stuff that is left on one side, and the other side is now fragmented by what you've done, and that of course will lead to a loss of biodiversity, and that's one of the other 4 basic principles of sustainability. Okay, so also you're opening yourself up to, and we are also, by going into the forests and bringing things into them, we're open up to non-native species, invasive species, and also as we go into the forests and deeper into the forests, we are contacting animals and some of these diseases that we don't normally see, and some of these diseases can go in, can be transferred to humans, and that becomes a problem as well. So here are 3 types of ways that we harvest trees here, and we'll talk about all of them in a little bit with some pictures to back it up. Here's the idea of the habitat fragmentation. You know, right away it starts with taking heavy machinery in here, so you're releasing CO2, of course, fossil fuels for that. Right away when you build the road, you're doing the fragmentation, and you can see as you go further into it and you're clearing out areas for agriculture, you are also fragmenting the habitats more and more. Okay, so this is just an up-close version of that one. And you can see it starts by just building that road in there. Already you're pounding down the ground, and then it just becomes more of an impact as you clear some stuff out. But there again, we do need to eat and we do need places to live, so there's got to be a balance here between what's ecologically good and what's environmentally good, and that's not always an easy balance to strike, of course. Okay, so here is a picture of selective cutting, and the idea of selective cutting is that you are taking out some of the trees. So the idea of being able to hold on to the soil and cut down on the erosion is still intact, so you're able to do that. And if you leave a bunch here by the bank, you've got a place for the sediments to get trapped, and now you still have clean water. clear water. And that's the thing about the erosion and the sediments getting into the water. Not only are you taking out the trees and taking out the services they can provide, you're also degrading the water in some cases. So here's the idea of clear cutting. With this one, there is no hold on to the erosion. You can see you've got a muddy stream, and that's the quickest profits in the short amount of time. So there's a benefit for that, of course, but ecologically speaking, it'll do the greatest damage. Okay, and the strip cutting here is one where you're basically keeping it intact. You're still fragmenting the habitation here, but this is one where you get to keep the clear stream. And hopefully you're doing this in ways that won't really degrade the environment as much. Now, it's more costly to do it that way, and you're not going to make as big a profit, so there's certainly ecological and environmental trade-offs going on there. Okay, so here's a picture of clear cutting in Washington State, and just the idea of on the left it has been undisturbed, and on the right it's a totally different picture when you go in there and do the clear cutting. All right, so here are some of the advantages. I've already really mentioned these already, and so here's some of the things that you can do, and some of the disadvantages, some of the advantages and the disadvantages, and we've kind of already talked about those as well. Okay, so how about fires now is another thing that we've been talking about here. And if we're talking about climate change, things are warmer a little bit longer. So maybe there's a drier climate, a hotter temperatures, and more chance of a fire. So that's a problem here. So we're going to talk about the two different types of fires. Surface fires are where the ground is burning. So if we have a surface fire around here, that's going to be the stuff that's lying on the ground. And that's not as detrimental. It's not going to rip through the forest as much as the crown fires are going to. And actually, in some cases, it's important to have the surface fires. If they happen in a small scale from time to time, the leaf litter and such can't burn up. There's less fuel for a major fire later on. So really, at some point or another, we tried to avoid fires, like that was always going to be a bad thing. And then I think we've come to realize that sometimes we need to do that. And they have what they call controlled burns from time to time, where they will on purpose burn an area there. Ground fires are very hot. They're going to go from the top of the trees. They're going to go from tree to tree to tree and take out the entire tree at that point. And that's going to be more soil erosion on that too. The crown fires are a lot worse. Which is the most dangerous type of fire from what I've said so far? Well, if you said crown fire, you are correct. Okay, so these are other things that we can do here. Right now there is the ash borer that is tearing up the ash trees out in the western part of our country right now. So sometimes these insects come through and they are hard to stop. Around here we get the gypsy moths from time to time. I haven't seen them for a couple years, but the gypsy moths are a big thing. And we've got to take a look at that too, insects that are taking the trees down. Another reason that climate change can affect this business with the insects is, well, do you see mosquitoes in the wintertime? Not as many mosquitoes in the wintertime. Their insects are happier in the hotter weather. So if you are having climate change increasing the temperatures, which has been happening, then you're going to find out that the season of the insects is a lot longer and they can do a lot more damage too. So that's the idea of that one. And as I mentioned already, the drier forests will cause more fires. Okay, and more fires mean more greenhouse gases too, because these fires, when they happen, are going to release carbon into the air, carbon dioxide into the air. Okay, so here's the surface fires, not so bad, and there's a crown fire. So there you got a graphic, that picture that gives you the difference between the two. Okay, so here are some of the things that are going on in, I mentioned the ash borer, that's a recent one. So here's a couple of other insect species and diseases that are messing with the trees. So that's a good one to be aware of. And okay, so deforestation, we have already cut down half of the world's forests, it says here. So that's been the thing here. And in tropical forests especially, it's problematic because many species are endemic to those areas. And that means if you cut down an area of the forest, some species are going to be wiped out immediately. They don't have any other place that they can live. And this is again an ecological and an economic kind of balance that we'd be looking for here. But I guess in terms of medicines, if there are medicines that could help us out, and we haven't fully investigated that yet, that can be a problem here. And we've been doing a lot of this for building products, for paper, and all kinds of things. Toilet paper is a big one. So we cut down trees for toilet paper, and of course then that's going to be wasted. All right, so this is something that folks are concerned with. Are we going to be doing this sustainably? Okay, so how about this? 46% of the original forests have been reduced, but as the population is growing exponentially, it seems that that's also happening faster and faster. Now, we're starting to preserve a lot of areas here in the United States. We're pretty affluent, and we're able to do these kind of things. And in some parts of the country where these the world where these tropical forests are, it's a little more difficult for them to do that. Okay, let's play the game again. What percentage of the U.S. is covered by forests currently? If you said 30%, you are correct. And how much of that is protected? So 40%. So like I say, in the U.S., we're doing a pretty good job of that. And what percent forests provide habitats for what percent of the U.S. wildlife species? Are they worth protecting? Well, we're talking about 80% of them. So the forests are big habitats. So preserving biodiversity is one of the 4 basic principles of sustainability, and the forests are a place where there is a lot of biodiversity. A lot of species live in there. Okay, and also water, lots of water in the forests. And that's why, again, if you get the erosion and the sediments, you are going to be dealing with that problem as well. There is such a thing as a tipping point. So there are cases where it's gone so far that they have cleared out a forest, and then there was a desert where the forest was before. So that's hard to come back from when that happens. Okay, so again, when settlers came over here, we started doing this, but we have had a big growth back. So we have a lot of secondary forests here, and also we have tree plantations around here. I've seen some driving right around in this local area here, and you probably have too. But yes, this area here where we are at is a deciduous forest area, and it was pretty well covered with trees. And we cut down a bunch of them early on, and since the early part of the 1900s, we've let a bunch of them grow back, and that's probably turned out to be a good thing. Okay, so the tropical forests are also disappearing. And yeah, so this is a good thing to know too. A lot of times what they're doing here is they are taking out these trees and they're using them to raise soybean crops, and they're using them to raise cattle. A problem with this is there are not a lot of nutrients in the ground for the tropical forests. Not a lot of leaf litter, not a lot of nutrients. So what happens is they clear out an area, and after they clear out the area, they plant for a couple years. It works out pretty well, and then they've used up all the nutrients. So they have to move on to the next area where they cut it down. And another thing that they do in there is what's called slash and burn agriculture. So they'll slash out the trees, they'll burn them all up, of course releasing all that carbon dioxide. They'll be able to plant there for a little while, and then they've got to keep moving on. So in South America, cattle and soybeans are a big reason why the tropical rainforests are being taken out. And in Southeast Asia, it's for the oil palm, which is a source of energy, and is also used in food products as well. So there's a big market for that. So there's money to be made. And there again, the environmental and the economic balance is the deal there. And as you take out the forest area, you are talking about this extinction of species as well. What did we learn in the other chapters? 90% of the area is taken out, 50% of the species will disappear. So there's a big role in that, species extinction. Okay. Let's see. All right, so here are images in the Amazon, South America, of course, and from 1975 to 2001, you can see that a lot of the forest has been taken out, and we're losing in animals and plants. Yeah, that's a big plant. I think that's some plant that only grows one time a year or something like that. That festive display there only comes one time a year. I'm not exactly sure. But anyway, the idea is there's so much diversity, as we've discussed before, in the tropical rainforests. All right, so why have we done this? Why are we doing this to the tropical rainforests? We don't know what we're doing. There's poverty that's leading people to try to make the quick money, and we also have the population growth. So those are the basic causes that drive it, and in trying to do that, we are going to create roads. There's going to be ranching. There's going to be logging. Setting them up with tree plantations cuts down on the biodiversity as well, and these cash crops like the palm oil or the soybeans are taken out as well. All right, so there you go. That gives you a little idea of what happens when they take these tropical forests out. Okay, so this is pretty interesting here too. But by burning these, we are putting a large amount of greenhouse gases into the air, and according to the blurb there, 2 times the amount of what we've done with cars and trucks. So a lot of carbon dioxide going into the air there. Okay, so what can we do? They have something called sustainable forestry, so you can vote with your money, vote with your pocketbook, as it were. And what you can do here is you can buy products that have been certified that they are doing them sustainably. And that's the idea with this. So maybe you have tree plantations. That way it's sustainable. You start planting trees as soon as you start cutting them down. You got a rotation going. These are ways to do it sustainably. And you know, some common sense things that maybe we didn't think of in the past when we thought these resources were unlimited. But now the resources seem more limited, and there's more and more people as well. So we have to do these. All right, so not building roads where there's an uncut forest, no logging in old growth forests are ways you can do it. Clear cutting on steep slopes, that makes sense from the picture that we saw before, would cut down on the erosion that could get into the water. And there we go. Okay, so let's see about the forest here. As I mentioned before, sometimes you do want the fires to happen. Actually, there's some trees that will only grow where there is a fire. Those old-growth sequoia trees out in California that I've seen, they kept trying to put out the fires, and it turns out they needed the fires to grow. They had to have the fires, so some do need that. Smokey the Bear campaign is only you can prevent forest fires was the big deal there. And the idea is that we went a little too far with that, with telling people that the fires were always a bad thing. Not always a bad thing, as we discussed before. And the prescribed fires is what I was talking. The controlled burns, prescribed fires, that's the thing there. Okay, so the Healthy Forest Restoration Act was a way to keep the forests intact. That was the idea of it. But in some cases now they've written into the act where you can go in and take the forests out, and that becomes a little bit of a misnomer, maybe, the Healthy Forests Restoration Act, because there's some things in there that are kind of detrimental to the forests. Okay, one thing is they were able to cut down some trees in the national forests. They were not going to do these prescribed burns, like I said before, so they were going to build up a bigger chance of what's going on, and they were also not subject to reviews that had happened before. So the pro is, it seems like a nice idea, Healthy Forest Restoration Act there, but those are some of the cons of it as well. Okay, so here's a company, the Collins Pine Company, and the idea of this is these are some of the people who will certify things. The Collins Pines Company, if you buy from them, they are certified as being sustainable, and the Forest Stewardship Council is a group that will certify you as being sustainable with your logging practices. Okay, and there are things that we can do here. We can come up with other materials besides trees. That's one of the things. We can use the wood a little bit more efficiently, cut down on waste. I mean, how much of the trees get cut down, get turned into junk mail, and just get thrown out? Recycling, I guess, can help with that. But these are some of the things that we can do, and coming up with other products that we can use instead of wood-based products are also pretty helpful. Okay, this is a plant that can be used to make paper, the Kenaf, and it grows pretty fast. And so when you cut that down and plant it back up again, you aren't really adding to the CO2, and you are protecting trees, so that's the idea there. Okay, so what can we do here? So we can burn the stuff more efficiently. We used to burn a lot more wood than we do now. We've come up with other things that we can burn in places where we're developed. In the developing world, they're still burning a lot of wood for fuel. So maybe some of that stuff is going to change over as we go into different energy sources such as solar and wind. All right, so in Haiti, they really went after it. They cut it down, and they had a bunch of the forest gone. Only 2% is back. South Korea was along that same path. They cut down a lot of the trees, and then they were very successful at bringing them back. They realized that they had gone too far. So these are some things that we could do. Debt for nature swaps. The idea on this one is that, maybe a country owes money. And what you do is you say to them, all right, we're going to forgive that debt, but you have to preserve this area of nature. So that's a tough one to go by there too. But here's some of the other ideas that we've already talked about. Okay, the Greenbelt movement. This is in Kenya in Africa, and this woman, Wangari Maathari, she actually got the Nobel Prize for organizing women, and usually the women don't have the role in this. It had been in that time a traditional men's society, and the women said, we're just going to plant trees. We need the trees to come back, and they were successful in doing that. Got her the Nobel Peace Prize. She passed away a couple of years ago while I was teaching this class, so we saw that in the Time magazine and talked about it. But also the idea here is, people can make a difference. There's one woman who made a difference, organized a bunch of people, and did something that, although she has passed on, is going to have a lasting, I think, positive effect. Okay, so here's the things that we could do, and we've really already kind of talked about these things already. So there they are in a chart for you. And you can certainly pause the video and take a look at them if you want. Okay, so how about rangelands now? Here's another thing with the rangelands. So this is where we're going to have animals out grazing and all that kind of thing, open roaming of them. But we have to, again, make sure that we aren't clearing these things out to cut down on too much of the diversity. And a lot of this carbon dioxide is also stored in the biomass. That's the plants holding on to it, biomass. And they're holding on to the carbon dioxide. Very important, of course, for nutrient cycling. And when you clear these things out, it's really tougher to control the erosion as well. And once you clear them out, it's hard for new soil to form as well. Hey, here's Mr. Francis. This is a special guest for you right now. He's all right, this guy. He's a physics teacher. You may know him from such subjects as physics. I'm sure some of you do. That guy's all right. He's made a fortune off of physics. I'm telling you right now. That guy's all right. Captain Francis. We like him. We like him a lot. All right, what else am I going to talk to you about here? Oh, man, guest appearance in my video. This is pretty fantastic. I wish I would have known. I would have paid extra. I would have had you pay extra for that one. Okay, so if they are overgrazing the rangelands, they're going to cut down on the grass. Well, this is all the stuff that we've talked about, too. The soil becomes more compacted. That makes it harder for the infiltration of the water. Okay, so all these things as well. This is an area, the Malapai borderlands out in New Mexico, where they had overgrazed it, and then they kind of limited it from the overgrazing. And, if we're smart about it, some of these things can come back, and that's a positive thing for us to be aware of. Okay, so here's the idea of the overgrazed and lightly grazed. So if you're too far, again, you've got an area that was doing some productive stuff for you, and now you basically have a desert there, and that's not going to be as productive. Right, so we can rotational grazing, that makes sense. Don't let them go everywhere, that's one thing. Cut down on some of the things that we have been doing here with invasive species, so try to keep them going. And there are some things that we can do to maintain the grasslands. Okay, fertilizer, cut down on the soil erosion, and there's some things. Okay, so this is stuff that was going on in the that has been going on, and now we're talking about the West. The Wild West is now being settled a lot more than it was before. So, of course, as always, we are having more problems because of the increase in population. So there are some of the things that we have been doing here in the American West anyway. Rotate cattle away from the riparian areas. That's the along the rivers, so we don't want the waste to get into the rivers. That's one thing. Also, the fertilizer and the pesticides can get in there as well. And there we go. Okay, so here's some ideas of some of the stuff that we're doing. And on the left is the same area that they were showing on the right. And it had been overgrazed and trampled down. And then when they kept them off those areas, the growth comes back. So that's the good news on it. It takes a little while, but it can come back. Oh, okay. Now the national parks. The biggest problem the national parks have is their popularity. There are so many people that want to go to these parks, and I can attest to that from the ones I've gone through. It's bumper-to-bumper traffic there in Yosemite. at all times, because people like to take a look at that one. But this is where the biodiversity is, and in the developing countries they haven't protected quite as much of it, so that becomes a problem. Poachers going in and taking the animals illegally, there's a big profit to be made of them, very hard to stop them from doing that, and even when they are protected, people are still going in and logging and mining, and so it becomes a real enforcement issue, and of course there's not a lot of money to go around, so that becomes a bit of a daunting task. Okay, so the U.S., like I said, the biggest problem is the popularity. In some places they have, if you want to get to a major attraction, you have to park a ways away from it, get a shuttle bus in, and this becomes a problem. When I was in Yosemite and you're looking at the beautiful, the beautiful environment, the beautiful landscapes, and you know that these cars coming through are just causing all kinds of devastation to them. So you're running your cars there in bumper-to-bumper traffic in some of the most beautiful land in the country. Okay, 58 major national parks in the U.S. I've been to quite a number of them. They are pretty amazing. If you get a chance, go check them out. Okay, so here's the idea. Off-road vehicles, gotta admit I'm guilty of some of this, but they trample down the soil, they lead to the erosion, cut down on the habitat, CO2 into the air, not great for the animals who are trying to live there. A lot of fun, admittedly, but that's a big problem for these areas. And what are we going to do? One of the things that we can do is keep this stuff from happening. We could have lands inside the park that we're going to reserve and say they're not going to be used for any of this stuff. Try to get, the government sometimes shuts down these national parks when we have economic problems. Maybe we can get volunteers in there, get people to donate for some of this stuff, maybe collect more money for people to come in. But yeah, these are some of the things that we have to do for the national parks, which are so successful, and that success in itself has become a problem. Okay, so here's some of the things that we can do. Maybe we can try to get these things. There are people who are trying to do this. People will buy up land in developing parts of the world to keep them from being developed. There are organizations that do this, and yeah, maybe we can do a little bit more talking to countries, try to help them out, some of these debt for nature swaps. So if we want to conserve them, we got to take a look at ways that we can do that. Okay, one thing that we can do here is the idea of a buffer zone and a habitat corridor. The habitat corridors are very interesting. I've seen this where there's highways. We need the highways, we have the traffic, there's all this demand for that, but they will build bridges or tunnels for animals to get across or underneath so that they can get from one area to the other without worrying about the highway. So that's a pretty good habitat corridor. Or maybe you have two areas that are pretty well good, but in the middle you've done all this developing. Maybe instead of developing the entire area in the middle, you leave a little strip, and after a while the animals figure it out, and that can be a good thing. With the buffer zones, what they'll do is they'll maybe allow some development, but that'll be around an area that is completely protected. So maybe you have an area that's completely protected, and then there's a ring around that that's semi-protected and a little less protected, and then maybe on the outskirts. But the idea is you got a buffer zone to keep the area, maybe that ecological hotspot that you're trying to protect from being in danger. And here's the idea of that. You got the core area, and maybe you have visitor centers and stuff, and you let people settle on the outskirts of the circle. And that's the idea of the buffer zone. So you get the hot spot in the middle that you really want to protect, but you give it a little buffer on the outside. Okay, Costa Rica has really done a lot with ecotourism. So maybe some of you have gone there already and seen the rainforest. That's pretty good. And they're committed to that. They're committed to cutting down on carbon dioxide emissions. And at one point, they were really, really degrading their tropical rainforests. And I guess they said enough is enough. And they have really made a big growth spurt in that. So good job, Costa Rica. And there you go. These are the big reserves that they have with the buffer zones built around them. And they have been a real success story. And like I said, a lot of ecotourism. I'm wondering, maybe some of you have gone there, and after you see the video, you'll share that thought with us. Right. How about the Wilderness Protection Act in the United States? All right, so there was the roadless rule, and the idea there was if there was no road, then you wouldn't be able to develop in there. That was a pretty good one. And then they kind of bend the rules a little, and when people use the off-road vehicles and make their own trails, they decided to characterize that as a road, and then development was okay. So that becomes a little bit of an issue there. So this wilderness protection has changed over the years here since 1964. And yeah, so the roadless areas within the National Forest System have ended too, and that's leads to more development. Okay, so here's what we can do. Identify the species, find out where these hotspots are, take a look before we develop on how it's going to be helping the biodiversity, and then maybe taking ecosystems that have been degraded, and we've seen a couple success stories in this video already, and try to help them out. And let them come back again, you know, take degraded areas and have them come back, restore them. And maybe think about new laws. That could be a thing. Here's the idea again about the hotspots. So maybe we should protect those. And maybe we need to increase the amount of funding that goes into that. But again, here we come again with the ecological and the economic situations going on in here. These biodiversity spots, they might have high plant species because that's how they identify them, but maybe they don't have a lot of animals. And then again, too, you have to think how it'll affect the people from an economic standpoint or the resources that they need to get to. All right, so here are some of 34 hotspots that have been identified. So we got some out in California, down in the tip of Florida there. And you can see in red all these biodiversity hotspots. And of course, the challenge is when some of these are in the developing world, you have to deal with the idea that they are resources that maybe those folks can't do as well without. Okay, so here are some hotspots in the U.S., a little closer up view of it for you. So Hawaii, all right. There you go, the Florida Panhandle. Nice spots. Get a chance to travel around this country. Lots of great spots. All right, that's just another view of it. And here's one in East Africa. So there is the highest concentration of what's going on in here. But again, it's a developing part of the world, and they are threatened by the usual things, but more so threatened because they are still developing, and they can't really afford to protect these areas as much as maybe we can, where we're a little more affluent. Okay, so this is the idea here. So again, it's just the idea of taking a look at what we consider to be a problem and maybe coming up with some kind of solutions as well. Okay, so yes, restore them, rehabilitation, replace them with other places, and artificial ecosystems are good too. Artificial reefs are coming up, and we're talking about creating areas and habitats so that we can really maybe turn back some of the damage that we've done to these ecosystems. Okay, and again, we have to kind of know what we're doing, if possible. Reintroduction of the species, the case study at the beginning with the gray wolves was an example of that. Once we know what we're doing, maybe we can protect them a little bit more. I think I have another guest here. Do I have another guest in my video? We have Mr. Francis Little. Here's Dr. Basu. You may know her from Such Subjects as Physics, and also Mr. Reese from Such Subjects as Physics. I didn't know the guests were going to come by. I would have charged you a little bit more for the video because they definitely add some value. I'm really lucky. Have I ever told you I got the best job in the world? These guys are the reason, part of the reason. You folks are too, you know. Oh, man, good job. All right, so let's see. Here's the idea of a forest, rainforest in Costa Rica, and this is some of the things that they were able to do. And it worked out pretty well for them. And a big part of this is getting the local people to buy into it. If they're not buying into it, then you're going to have, you're less likely to have some success. Okay, and here's a place in Wisconsin where these folks associated with the university, I believe, decided to try to restore it, and that was one of the first really successful ones there in the United States. And since then we know a little bit more about it and how it can happen. People can make a difference. And as usual, preventing a problem is easier than cleaning it up, so it's a little bit maybe worth our effort to do that. 5% of the Earth's land is preserved. Okay. You know, in Monroe, we're doing 50%. 50% open space we're going to preserve. So we're way ahead of that curve in Monroe. Monroe seems to be committed. With all the development, it's been a lot of development in Monroe, but we seem to be committed to, they've made a pledge, 50% will be conserved. All right, so this is the way we can do things, with other species. And the idea of this one here, the reconciliation or applied ecology, the idea of this one is you're going to create places where humans can live, but animals can live as well. So you got monkeys in your neighborhood or something like that. That'll be a good thing, and I guess for the monkeys. And so that's the idea on that one. The insect pollinators, we've become more aware of the bees and the crisis that they were up against, so we're protecting them. Of course, they're important pollinators as well. And these are examples of where we get the try to live with the species. So the reconciliation or applied ecology is we're trying to have humans live in where other species are living as well. And this has been something that has been going on here in the Blackfoot River. This was a good thing, too, where the people were just a little bit upset about it, and there was all this development that was going on by outside people, and then the people who lived there said, they started getting together and identified it as a problem, and they were able to turn it back as well, and that's organizing the local people. The local people having a buy-in is a big part of it. So they had done some things unsustainably, probably made some big profits in there, and then in Montana, the local people said, we got to turn this back, and they did. Had a nice shot at that. So what do? Plant a tree, adopt a forest, recycle your paper, buy sustainable products, use wood substitutes, landscape your yard so that it's not too bad for the surrounding environment, and maybe cut down on some of those weed killers that get into the soil and damage a lot of things. So there are things that you can do, and that brings us to the end of a rather long video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that it was helpful for you, and I look forward to seeing you back in class.